Sounds so. I'm really pleased to welcome you to this seminar with both national and international participants at the University of Stavanger on freedom of belief, intellectual freedom, freedom of conscience, and Quakers as part of the democracy discourse through 200 years. We have got support for this seminar from different institutions, as put on the screen, and we are very happy that we were able to manage to put it together, both in terms of participants and in terms of finance. And I would like to welcome you as participants, as scholars, students, and other interested people. University of Stavanger is hosting this seminar, and I am chairing this first day and have been part of the preparation. My name is Geir Skeie, and I'm working mainly with religion and education here at the University of Stavanger and also Stockholm University. But I've worked together with Hans-Eirik Aarek on the program, on the preparation, and really he is the person who has done the big job. So I'm just the front figure here, and Hans-Eirik is the main person. And we have been colleagues for quite some years here at the University of Stavanger, but our relation go way back. I had Hans-Eirik as my first lecturer in philosophy in 1972, so he's not a new person to me. And I'm also proud to be working together with you on this seminar, and I'm pleased that we got it off the ground and that we are able to start up now. We are here today, and we are moving to Tysvær in the north of Rogaland County tomorrow, so it's a seminar on the move, so to speak. We're also very happy that we have got Marit Boyesen, the rector of the University of Stavanger, to wish us welcome to this and start this seminar, and I will hand the word over to you, Marit.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure and also a great honor for me as rector of the University of Stavanger to welcome you to this very interesting seminar on religious freedom as seen from a minority perspective. The University of Stavanger, which this year celebrates its 10th year's anniversary, is located in a region that has played a major part in the religious history and dissident history of Norway. And the subject of this seminar is of great importance both today and for the future ahead. And history reveals that being a part of a minority has never been easy. This year we commemorate the 200th year anniversary of the Norwegian Constitution. But 1814, the year of the Constitution, also saw another event, because this was the year when the Norwegians who had been imprisoned in England during the Napoleonic Wars returned home. And many of the former prisoners had become Quakers whilst in prison. Back in Norway, they settled in Stavanger and Oslo, then called Christiania, where they became pioneers in the fight for religious freedom. Until Norway abolished the Dissenter Act in 1845, there was a ban on religious assemblies without the consent of the church. In the Quakers' case, the obstacles they met and the desire for great religious freedom led them to initiate the first Norwegian emigration to America in 1825, when the Slope Restoration left from Stavanger with 52 emigrants. Other groups that were strongly affected by the ban were the Jews and the Hauge movement. The Jews were in fact banned from Norway until 1851. The few Jews resident in Norway before this time had converted to Christianity but some may secretly have practiced their Mosaic belief. The founder of the Hauge movement, Hans Nilsen Hauge, was imprisoned for his belief. But the struggle of the dissenters for religious freedom was important as a signal to society at large, demonstrating that people were willing to make sacrifices for their beliefs. And ultimately, it led to higher tolerance and greater rights for minorities, and to a more open and free society. To what extent the majority accepts the minority in society is often regarded as the litmus test of democracy. And that is why it is so important that each and every one of us always have the minority perspective in mind, and that the perspective is on the agenda as it is at this seminar. I wish you 2 interesting and fruitful days, both here at the University of Stavanger and for tomorrow in Tysvær. And when I looked at the program, I should really wish to be part of this seminar. Here is very much to learn, and I can imagine there will be many good discussions. So thank you for coming to Stavanger, and good luck. Thank you.
We have already a program to dig into now and for the rest of the day. And we will start with our keynote lecturer, Pink Dandelion, who is the real senior research figure, I would say, in Quaker studies. And we are very happy to have you here. You have a relationship with Norway and with Hans Eirik and others, I know, and you will also say a little bit about Quakerism in the beginning before entering into your theme. So I'm very pleased to have you here and look forward to your lecture.
Is that working? Oh. Well, thank you very much, Geir, and thank you to Hans Eirik also for inviting me here. This feels like a very significant conference, and I'm very excited to be part of it. So, as Geir said, I'm going to first of all just say a little bit about Quakerism in general, just to set the scene. Oops. Talk about its beginnings and some of its key ideas, and then I'll move into my paper, which is looking more at ideas of citizenship and religious freedom and how we're to think about these in a more theoretical sense. So we can date Quakerism back to 1647. In some senses, the founder, George Fox, was born in the Midlands of England, and he was really someone who was very concerned with the spiritual quest. He was, he left his work age 19 and he travelled around England during the Civil War period, visiting the army camps where the most radical religious ideas were circulating. And he was looking for answers. He was really looking for the kind of answer that the whole of England was looking for. How should the nation be in relationship with God? And part of that question also relates to how are people to be saved? And these really were probably the most important questions for people in that time, even as they struggled to survive through a series of failed harvests and through the war itself. Well, he'd already discovered that the state church idea that you had to be tutored at Oxford or Cambridge was he said this is not sufficient to fit a man to be a minister of Christ. It's not an adequate enough idea. And so he said he regarded the priests less and looked more after the dissenting people. Well, then he said, though, he left those people also because he said there were none among them all that could speak to his condition. His hopes in all men were gone. They had nowhere to turn, no one who was offering him the kinds of answers he was looking for. And it's this point, in 1647, where in a very low place, in a sense, he doesn't know where to turn, when he has this very important spiritual experience where he says, and then I heard a voice, that there is one, even Christ Jesus, that can speak to his condition. So in other words, he discovers in this moment, age 23, that he could have a direct relationship with God. And that he'd been, in a sense, looking in the wrong places. He'd been looking in books, he'd been looking to other people. But actually the answer came that he could have a direct relationship with God. And that's really the foundational experience for Quakerism. That in fact there's no need to be looking in those outward forms because of this, the authentic spirituality is inward. There's a few important things to say about this experience of his in 1647. The first is that he considers this experience to be a universal possibility. So in other words, one of the ways we can look at the history of Christianity is maybe as a history of different prophets who've turned up and felt they've been given some special dispensation, spiritual dispensation, but then somehow that everyone needs to listen to them. Okay, because they have it and other people can't have it, but they can have it through the prophet. And there's lots of examples of that in Christian history. The interesting thing about George Fox and the early Quakers is that they felt that this was an experience that everyone could have. Everyone then was a minister in what would become the new church. Everyone was spiritually equal. And that's also a very important concept within Quakerism, and it plays out in a number of ways. It underpins the commitment to peace and non-violence, because everybody is equally a child of God within Quaker theology. So while Fox was the leader, he wasn't claiming any greater spiritual authority than anyone else, and that's very important. The other thing I've mentioned is that this is focused on an inward experience, and early Quakers are very critical of the outward forms, whether it's church liturgy, or and early Quakers, and Quakers, some Quakers today still meet in silence as a way of trying to nurture this sense of encounter with God. But lots of outward forms, whether it's finery or the way you dress or the way you speak even, were planed. They were made plainer in Quaker practice. So very early on there's advice about fashion and not having any unnecessary buttons and no earrings and things like this. So and there's even talk about George Fox not saying good morning to anybody, because that would just be politeness. You wouldn't, unless you really were moved by God to say it, why would you say it? And there's a tale of him coming down into a northern town, and he has this other accent, and someone says, well, where are you from then? And he could say, well, I'm born about 200 miles away, but he says, from the Lord. So, he says what he feels he's prompted to say. And there's even talk of a Quaker way of walking, which really, for those of us who research Quakerism, we spend a lot of time thinking about this. So, practicing with students and things, Anyway, but Quakers were quickly identified. They wouldn't use the deferential form you. They would use thee and thou to everybody. So in English, they were using these two forms of you. One, if you met a kind of social superior, you'd say, oh, you, and then you'd say thee and thou to your friends. Well, they just used thee and thou to everybody. sort of levels society down. Everyone is equal. Everyone is equally important, but not, you know. So they won't use titles for anybody and things like this. And they will walk in a way that is plain as well. So the latest theory on this is, you know, that if you were a rich person, you'd have lots and lots of material wrapped around you, and you would sort of have to swing a leg, really, to move yourself. You might have a stick. And you would be showing off your wealth and abundance in that way. Whereas for these early Quakers, who then wanted to just be true and hold some kind of integrity in this new and exciting relationship with God, there would be a minimum of material maybe. You'd be fairly constrained by what you were wearing, and you may literally be walking much more like this. Okay, this is where we've got to in scholarship at the moment. They refused to use the names for days and months because they had pagan origins. So you'd have first day and second day and third day rather than Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. Basically there's a whole set of lifestyle issues that come out of this Quaker experience. So obviously you won't pay tithes, which is a payment to the church, because the church is wrong. And so you're not going to support the opposition, in a sense. You're not going to swear an oath, because why would you say, I'm now swearing to tell the truth? What does that say about what you're saying the rest of the time? And as I said, there's this plain dress, plain speech, and also a commitment to non-violence and against war. So the other thing about this experience then focuses on the inward. It tries to downplay the outward as inauthentic. But it's also obviously a transformative experience. Fox's life was changed in 1647, and those who become Quakers in the 1650s, their lives are changed. They feel they're taken into a new spiritual place, in a kind of intimacy with the divine, where they are saved in this life, and where they can resist sin and temptation. There's lots of grand claims about early Quakerism. They don't need priests, they don't need scripture, they're saved, they're free from sin. You know, this is a very arrogant or grand movement. And it really does infuriate every other Christian, because, you know, they're sort of saying things that really fly in the face of the way that the church had been moving. Even the reforming movements weren't going this far. So Calvinism was saying, well, it's not just the hierarchy who will be saved, the elect are dotted throughout society. Well, Quakers are coming along and saying everyone is part of the elect. There's a universal elect. So it just takes everything another step. And maybe I don't need to say this, but this is not an ecumenical movement. It's not a movement that's sort of sitting over one side of the spiritual marketplace and saying, well, we'll be Quakers here, and you can be Baptists there, and, you know, everyone's equally fine. This is a group that is absolutely convinced that it's right. Okay, because this is the right way to be in relationship with God. And so mission becomes very important for early friends. There's a mission even to the Pope in 1658. Doesn't go as well as they hoped, but it would, it's interesting. So, and the concept of the world becomes very important. World and worldliness. Basically, for the early friends, everyone else is part of the world, because everyone else is wrong in some way. And Quakers are particularly critical of those in power, those who are holding people back from this new possibility, this new way of being in relationship with God, and they're all part of the world. Okay, so we hear quite a lot of this use of the term world and worldliness. So just some key dates. So Fox has this experience in 1647, but he's fairly quickly put into jail. He's asked if he's the son of God, and he says yes. But he then says, as everyone is who is in this new relationship with God. Everyone's the children of God. So, still into jail. Comes out after a year, and he heads to the north of England, where there are a number of groups who are sympathetic to these ideas. And it's in the north of England that the movement really takes off in the summer of 1652. Suddenly hundreds, then thousands of converts, including people like Margaret Fell, who is part of the gentry, and she's able to offer her home, Swarthmore Hall, as a headquarters for the Quaker movement. And her husband, a judge, is able to offer a certain degree of sort of legal protection for this early movement. 1654, there's a mission to the rest of England and Wales. 30 pairs of Quakers going off, and one of the ways Rosemary Moore, who's the expert in this period, says that one of the reasons for the success of the Quaker movement is the depth of leadership. There are that many able people who are drawn to the movement. It just doesn't depend on George Fox. One of those other people is James Naylor. He's a Yorkshire Quaker, very, very able. But in 1656 he's arrested for riding into Bristol, enacting a sign of Christ's entry into Jerusalem. So again, he is accused of believing he is Christ, and only just escapes with his life. But it's a fragile moment for Quakerism. James Naylor, co-leader of the Quaker movement. 1660, the monarchy is restored in Britain, and this becomes a difficult time for Quakers, the start of 30 years of persecution. This is sort of payback time for those who've been marginalised during the Republic, and Quakers, there's even a Quaker Act in 1662 that outlaws Quakerism. A number of the early leaders die. Quakerism has to become a little more cautious, negotiate a bit more in order to survive. And a number of new converts, like William Penn, have a slightly different attitude to this idea of the true church. And when William Penn sets up Pennsylvania as a holy experiment in 1681, it's based on an idea of religious toleration for everybody. And so there we get a kind of a functional kind of a way of operationalizing religious toleration in a new context, in a way that hadn't been happening for British Quakers in England and Wales. And Quakerism then develops, and it goes through a number of different theological periods. It has a period of more introspective spirituality in the 18th century, evangelical spirituality in the 19th century, and in the way that Protestant-type groups do, starts to divide, and schism in the 19th century. So today, if we looked across the Quaker world, we'd find 500,000 Quakers worldwide, but divided into three main categories of evangelical, conservative and liberal. But still a world family of friends, that those Quakers, in spite of their differences, are still in conversation. And that's very important. Over time, mission in some settings turns to service. And in a sense we can see the early contacts with the prisoners the Norwegian prisoners in Kent as part of, not really as part of Quaker mission explicitly, but as part of Quaker service that then touches those prisoners and brings Quakerism to Norway when they return in 1814. So, hopefully that's given you a little bit of an overview. I should say now that I don't think there's any group of Quakers today that think Quakers are the true church. That disappears by the 19th century. But some of these foundational ideas are still there, particularly this idea of direct encounter this idea of an immediate and personal spirituality. So, okay, so now I'll turn to what I wanted to say originally, which is thinking about religious freedom and citizenship, and hopefully now we have some kind of context in which to understand it. So there's a book coming out next year called Early Quakers and Their Theology, which looks at many of these early friends or Quakers and looks at their key ideas. And one of the chapters is on Richard Farnworth, who was one of the Yorkshire people, one of the northern people that Fox moved towards when he came out of prison, and who becomes really very important in laying out Quaker ecclesiology, the way that the church is to be. And Richard Farnworth writes a number of very key documents in the 1650s and the 1660s. Well, he also writes pamphlets about religious toleration towards the end of his life, trying to allow Quakers the benefits of being treated as equal citizens. And I think that's very important, that when we talk about religious toleration, we're also in a way talking about citizenship. That if you're seeking to be tolerated or accepted in the same way as people of different religions, you're trying to be treated as a citizen of the state. Now, Michael Burkle and Stephen Angel from Earlham have written this chapter on Richard Farnworth, and they conclude their chapter that they say that Farnworth's efforts of writing in favour of religious toleration did not convince non-Quakers. They weren't convincing. He didn't have the persuasive tactics of William Penn. And even at the end of his writing career, Farnworth adhered to the first generation's conviction that Quakers alone had the truth. And therefore he could not, in good conscience, argue for toleration as a right equally due to non-Quakers. Okay? So in other words, because he felt that really Quakers were right, that came through his writing, and it wasn't very easy then to try and say, well, and these other people also should, be allowed to worship. It's a sort of a singular religious toleration. Just let us do what we want to do because we're right, but you don't need to worry about those other people. And obviously that wasn't very convincing for non-Quakers. Why would they listen to that? So Burkle and Angel identify here the tension between the idea of the true church and the bid for toleration. Okay, these two things are in tension, because the bid for toleration by default needs also to apply to those beyond the true church. In fact, you have to let go of the idea of the true church in order to argue for religious toleration. They're inimical ideas. In Farnworth's case, he holds too much to this idea of the true church to be convincing about toleration. Is unconvincing. And this, as I say, is the main tension between the self-perception of a religious group, in this case the Quakers, as uniquely correct in their religious proclamations, or one that sees itself as trying to assimilate within a nation in an attempt to be treated as citizens. They're just an alternative religious group, not the true religious group. So, in other words, for the people within this religious group, is the world? So, is the world a place to be described in pejorative terms, to be opposed or overcome? Or does wider society represent a viable context in which to express a spirituality which could be seen as equivalent to others? Okay? I hope that's clear, because it doesn't feel very clear, but basically, true church, in which case you want to overcome the world, you want to oppose other people, or equivalent church, and therefore let's be citizens and let us just do our own thing. These two things are in tension. What we can see in the history of Quakerism is a shift from this first idea of the true church to one in which Quakers are actually seeking toleration over time, particularly as things get more difficult in the 1660s. And if we look at the history of Quaker studies scholarship, and indeed even the sociology of religion, we can see a tendency to try to identify a single moment when this happens. Okay? So thus, for example, historians of Quakerism tend to portray the first decade as this somehow is kind of pure expression of Quaker spirituality, of essential Quaker spirituality, in which the world is used as a pejorative term, denoting all that is not of God, which is then succeeded or superseded by a subsequent period characterized by a formalization of what it means to be a Quaker, a negotiation with the state of how to be Quaker. And we've got a whole series of dates. We can line up different scholars. Richard Allen, who we're going to be hearing from later, is working with Rosemary Moore on a book on the second period and dating it from 1656. So, you know, even there, where Naylor's riding into Bristol, something is changing. So, or 1660 and the restoration of the monarchy and the start of persecution. That's the start of the second period. 1666 is the start of the second period, because this is when Quakers stopped talking about the second coming so much. There's a plague in England, there's fire, the Great Fire of London, and the Dutch Navy destroy the British Navy. Okay? Not that we hear about that very much in British history, but apparently if you're in the Netherlands it's a major topic. Anyway. Well, even with all those signs of the times, the second coming doesn't happen. It's not the end of the world as Quakers have been thinking it might be. And so they start to talk about the second coming of Christ less. So that's the start of the second period. Well, then other people like Michel Tarter and, or 1666 is the start of the second period, because that's when Richard Farnworth writes Testimony from the Brethren, which lays out the structure of a Quakerism which is now in for a longer haul. It realizes that it's going to be around for longer than it thought it was, and basically need to sort of knuckle down, not for the end time, but for the meantime. So that's the end of the first period and the beginning of the second period. Or the start of Second Day Morning Meeting in 1673. This is a Monday morning meeting of ministers who happen to be in London, and it is the Publications Committee. And from that day, anything that's to be printed in the name of Quakers has to go through this committee. And there's talk of censorship, but there's certainly management of how Quakers are presented to the world. Well, then this is the start of the second period. Or another thesis, just 2 years old, 1678 is the start of the second period. Because that's when you get Meeting for Sufferings and the yearly meeting. Meeting for Sufferings is the executive committee, in a sense, that petitions government on behalf of the sufferings of friends. So, and that starts in 1678. Or the structure is complete by 1678. So one of the things we can certainly say about Quaker studies and the history of Quakerism is that there's a great deal of enthusiasm for trying to get these dates right and periodizing Quaker history. And I am equally guilty of that. I've got a 6-stage flow chart, and I've got, you know, all kinds of things. These are the dates, no, these are the dates. And then 1661 is also seen as a very important date, because in 1661 Quakers offer a declaration to Charles II, the new king, to say that basically Quakers are a peaceful group and are not a threat to the monarchy. Okay? In 1661 another group called the Fifth Monarchists take over the city of London for a few days. Must have been incredibly exciting. Just about 50 of them, like a little anarchist, religious anarchist revolution. And just 50 of them, but the state knows that Quakers are the most dangerous group, and there's far more Quakers. There's, you know, 1% of the English population has become Quaker by this time, and 4,000 Quakers are then put into jail just in case they're going to be part of this revolution. Okay, you haven't done anything, but you might do. They put you into jail. So it's a good idea. So, anyway, and so then 12 Quakers send a declaration to King Charles II and say, you needn't worry about us. Okay, we utterly deny all outward wars. We're not going to plot against the crown, and we're not going to take up arms, because we fight an inward war, spiritual warfare, not an outward warfare. It's an unequivocal declaration of harmlessness. And it's seen by many, though, as a kind of the underpinning of the Quaker commitment to peace. But in many ways, it actually highlights a move towards a greater negotiation with the state, born out of a need to survive. And the fact, as I said, the whole of Britain isn't becoming Quaker at the rate that the leaders had thought. So, in a sense, it's part of this campaign for religious toleration. You know, just let us be. You don't need to put us into jail. Let us be, and we'll just get on with it over here. Thank you very much. We're not a threat. Okay. And so we can see this not really as the beginning of the peace testimony, but also as a mark of negotiating with the state. So the campaign by Quakers seeking to be treated as citizens is part of a move away from that sort of prophetic enthusiasm of the first period. It's an alternative way of presenting Quakerism. And it's an alternative way, alternative sort of self-understanding of what it is to be a Quaker. And as I've said before, that this idea of citizenship and religious freedom are concepts that denote the aspiration of any new social or religious movement to be assimilated. Okay, if you're trying to do that, you're trying to be part of something. Citizenship is a concept which by definition is embedded and distributed within hegemonic culture. However, I want to challenge this idea that there's some kind of single moment where this takes place, where this shift from one to the other takes place. And rather I want to suggest that there's an ongoing dynamic between resistance and assimilation that carries on, and that any debate about watershed dates making irreversible change is misleading. Now, so let's just look at a few more theoretical frameworks, particularly within the sociology of religion. So not only have the historians of Quakerism looked for this sort of single moment where everything changes, but that's a very typical motif within the sociology of religion. And has been a very keen focus of sociology of religion, even while now they're often more concerned with secularization. So Max Weber develops a church-sect typology. He looks at kinds of religious groups and he divides them into church or sect. Church as an association for the administration of grace, that everyone is necessarily born into, a kind of compulsory association, or a sect as a voluntary association of religiously qualified people. What he means by that is you have to fit in, you have to behave in the way that the sect requires you to. It places high demands on you to change your life. Ernst Troeltsch then added further characteristics to sect typology, saying that sects had different perceptions of priesthood, sacraments, and this idea of the world as a pejorative term. So there's decades of scholarship around sect and church. Well then, in the 60s and 70s, Richard Niebuhr and David Martin introduced the idea of the denomination. Okay, so they're sort of nuancing sect and church typology. And Richard Niebuhr argued that sects routinely developed into denominations in the second generation, that it was almost a matter of course. In Weber's terms, that charismatic authority would become routinized and the sect would become a denomination. And you could just plot this in a number of instances of new religious groups. Whereas David Martin suggested that actually some groups just began as a denomination, and that some sects just remained sects or died. You know, there wasn't this sort of necessary progression. Well, Brian Wilson mirrors David Martin's work, labelling Quakers as an introversionist sect in the 18th century and as a reformist sect in the 20th century. And what he means by that is that, by reformist sect, is that the way that, in his view, that Quakers today would be trying to save the world is by trying to reform people's consciences. And that's sort of the final trajectory of the mission of the 1650s. But other scholars have tended to follow Richard Niebuhr's line, that there was this necessary development from sect to denomination with the second generation. And it's really whether that second generation idea is correct or not. And so you get people then arguing about when the sect became a denomination. Or to use this very rather awkward phrase, denominationalized. So Niebuhr is saying, well, it's going to be in the second generation, so we're talking about 1680s. Then you get Richard Van saying, no, it's in the 1720s. And then you get Elizabeth Isichet looking at British Quakers and saying, well, you can see it happening in the 19th century. This is when British Quakerism became a denomination. Okay? And, again, you get this major debate. In the 19th century, British Quakers could become members of Parliament, they could finally join the professions, and they could finally attend universities. And so it looks like all the hallmarks of citizenship and maybe of being a denomination. They become more permissive with the greater degree of freedom they're given. But I suggest this very debate about timing suggests a problem with between, the difficulty of fit between theory and reality. And I want to look at Roy Wallace's work, who's another sociologist of religion, for something that may be more helpful. He proposed a threefold typology of religious movements in terms of their attitudes towards the world, towards the surrounding context. World rejecting, world affirming, and world accommodating. And he says that to map a religious group, you have to do it at a specific moment. Because, and this is different from all these other theories, a movement may shift around considerably during the course of its development. It's not going to be one thing, or one thing and then one other thing. It's going to move between, in his terms, these three positions. And it's not a necessary movement. That's the other thing. So it's different from Niebuhr's idea of a necessary shift to denomination. So let's think about Wallace's definition of world rejecting first of all. This holds the view, so a group that's world rejecting holds the view that the prevailing social order has departed substantially from God's prescription and plan. Okay? So the nation or the world has moved away from where God might wish it to be. So therefore an adherent of a world-rejecting movement is involved in a life of service. They suppress their own desires and goals in expression of the greater commitment to the greater good of the movement. Such movements often expect that the end of the world will come shortly, or that the movement will sweep the world, and then a new world order will begin. One that's more humane, or more spiritual, or more utopian. Typically, groups collapse distinctions between secular and religious. It just becomes a singular religious vision. The lifestyle of adherents may appear deviant, but also highly organised and controlled by the group. Individual will is subjugated to collective solidarity. So This has all the hallmarks of a strict sect, whether a political sect or a religious one. Communal clothing or uniform dress codes may be one way of expressing this. And this fits very well with what we've heard about the Quakerism of the 1650s. People starting to dress the same, speak the same. They appear deviant, they appear totally at odds with the host culture. And Gay Pilgrim, another British scholar, has argued that this fits in with Michel Foucault's concept of heterotopia, which is a phrase used to describe where things are in really the most unexpected places. It originated as a medical term, that, you know, bodily organs would not be where you expect them to be. They're not next to the things where they should be. Instead, they're heterotopic. They're in a mixed up place. And Foucault gives the example of finding a fairground in a prison courtyard. That would be heterotopic. And Gay Pilgrim looks at the early Quaker lifestyle and mission and says it's heterotopic. They turn courtrooms into pulpits. You know, everywhere becomes, you know, suddenly things that are meant to be used for one purpose become used for another. And this fits very much in with Roy Wallace's world-rejecting characteristics. Now, then, in Wallace's terms, there's world-affirming, where they may have no collective ritual or form of worship, nor necessarily even a shared theology or ethics. The surrounding context seems largely desirable, but maybe humanity needs to do a bit more work. But there's not, there's not this major critique of the world in the same way. These groups claim that they may have the means to unlock the puzzle, the last piece of human progress. Rather than challenge the world, they're about benefiting more easily from all the world has to offer. And we could see this perhaps approximating the more pragmatic expressions of Quakerism which emerge after 1660. Maybe the world isn't such a bad place, or, and maybe the end of the world isn't going to come, and maybe we need to work with the world, but we have the last little piece that, so. Now, Wallace describes the world accommodating, his third element, in far less detail than the other two. And the Finnish scholar Kai Björkqvist claims that actually generally the three dimensions of Wallace's typology make it rather unhelpful. And Björkqvist instead says, well, let's just stick with world rejecting and world affirming. And let's have a single axis between these two, and we can plot where groups are. Are they more world rejecting, or are they more world affirming? And Björkqvist also incorporates then a theory of goal displacement, in which new goals for the group, goals that are more attractive or seem to be more attainable, replace old goals and allow organizations to change their emphasis, to face a new direction. And so in this way, Björkqvist both simplifies Wallace's typology, just has a single axis, but he also allows for the fact how and why groups change their position along it. What are their goals at this moment? Will they be then world rejecting or world affirming in order to realize these goals? Now, there's other typologies we could use. Wolf Mendel, who was a professor of war studies at King's College London, came up with the idea of religious-based activism falling into two axes as well, one of prophetic and the other of reconciliatory. And we might match those up to world-rejecting or world-affirming. So prophecy seemed to be in direct obedience to the supernatural, regardless of consequence. Okay, so the mission to the Pope, you go and tell the Pope that the Pope is the Antichrist, even if you're going to be hanged the next day. You do the right thing, you're prophetic. Today, Quakers would not do that. If they had a difficulty with something that was coming out of the Vatican, they might write a letter. Okay? And it would be in a more reconciliatory frame of reference. So reconciliation is rooted in outcome, in actually being strategically successful. So we could look at, we can look at some of the ways early Quakers were as world-rejecting, but also as prophetic, and we might look at a more modern emphasis as world-affirming and reconciliatory. And we can see this negotiation with the state over religious freedom, over citizenship, as reconciliatory. It's about trying to reconcile, about trying to achieve assimilation. So, as I said, we can see these shifts as early as 1656, when James Naylor rides into Bristol and is arrested. This is such a difficult case for the Bristol magistrates that they refer his case to Parliament. They don't want to touch it. 10% of the population of Bristol are Quaker, and if they do the wrong thing, they're going to have a revolt on their hands. So they pass it to Parliament. Oliver Cromwell, Protector, King of the Republic, says, well, you decide what you need to do. He doesn't want to take responsibility either. And George Fox, leader of this prophetic movement, writes to Parliament and says, you need to do what you need to do. Okay? Now, it might look like, George Fox is being rather uncharitable, or, but it's probably more about a fragile moment in Quaker history. And so it's about surviving. What's the goal at this point? It's to survive. Therefore, let's be world-affirming and reconciliatory. So, we could say here at this point, 1656, we can see Quakers being reconciliatory. Now, in 1659, Cromwell has died. There is no king. Nobody knows really what's going to happen to the government of England. How will England be governed? And there's a great sense of possibility again amongst some of the early Quaker writers. There's all that second coming rhetoric is coming out again. People like Dorothy White are sending off tracts to the government saying the day of the Lord is at hand, you must repent now, or, And Quakers are clearly prophetic her tracts are clearly prophetic in 1659. So in other words, it is a dynamic relationship, and Quakerism is moving backwards and forwards along this line between world rejection and world affirmation. Between the reconciliatory and the prophetic. In the mid-1960s, during the Vietnam War, there's a Quaker, Norman Morrison, who sets fire to himself on the steps of the Pentagon as a prophetic act. It's a world-rejecting act. At the same time that Quakers are lobbying the Quaker president, Richard Nixon, about trying to end the war. So these are things that often also happen at the same time. So, okay, how are we doing? Okay. Well, I've got a few more historical examples, and I can leave some of them out if we're going on too long. So I think, hopefully, I'm showing this shift. I'll maybe give one more. Let's see which is the better example. Yeah. So, just within the work of one author, Edward Burrow, another very early Quaker, even between 1657 and 1658, he's changing the way he's talking to non-Quakers. So, in 1657, he writes to kings, princes, and rulers amongst the whole world, "The Lord is coming up with his mighty host against you all. He who will fan you and sift you and try you and search you out. All your glory shall fade away. All your majesty and honour and dignities and dominions shall come to an end. All your strength is but as a straw. All your treasure as a thing of naught. All your glory as a fading leaf." Okay? So, it's pretty clear that really all that outward stuff means nothing, and they better watch out because the Lord's coming. And, okay? Quakers are right. and you're wrong, and you know. So the good news is, of course, the good news from the Quaker perspective is that everyone could become a Quaker, you know, should and could. So, in another tract, they tell Oliver Cromwell he should repent, and if he repents, he will have the necks of princes to stand on. But if he doesn't, it will be his neck. So Quakers are very clear. Okay, in the interview with the Pope, Alexander VII, this Quaker says, you know, you say you're a descendant of Peter, but really you're nothing like Peter. Peter was a simple person, living simply. Look at you with your grand palace and your gay attire and all these fancy clothes. You know, Peter was a fisher of souls. You put hooks in people to confound them. Peter was a follower of Christ. Thou art indeed the Antichrist. Okay? This is, basically we'd say this is world rejecting and prophetic. Okay? It's not, they're not trying for assimilation. They're not saying, please, we'd like to be Catholics as well, or will you tolerate us? They're saying you're wrong. Okay. In Burroughs' terms, worldly power is nothing compared to the glory and majesty of God. So there's this big dualism, you know, worldly, heavenly, those who know the way to the Lord and those who don't, those who will be saved and those who won't. However, after 1658, in the death of Cromwell, Burrough is writing to the authority in a much more measured tone. He's less optimistic by this sudden instability. He's interested in negotiating with authority. He's worried that things are going to get very difficult for Quakers. And he wants to show how Quakers don't threaten law and order. So in 1658 he writes to magistrates on religious toleration. And he ends the tract as, he signs it, a real friend to the Commonwealth, to the Republic. You know, I'm really one of you. And in the same year he writes to the Pope, again in a much more reconciliatory line than that earlier interview I just mentioned. And he writes to friars and nuns in France, you know, and he's sort of, you know, just being a lot more ecumenical. So, in 1661 he writes to the king around why religious conscience should be upheld by the government. And given the theme, I will go through these many reasons. He says it's purely God's right to judge the spiritual life of humanity. And therefore it's not up for a government to do that. Okay? It's not the government's job to judge the spiritual life of humanity. And if the government did take on this unlawful aspect of rule, it would therefore undermine its own legitimacy. People would understand it wasn't doing what it should do, it was doing something it shouldn't do. As well as it would be opposing God, because this is God's job. And if force was involved, and of course Quakers were experiencing forced imprisonment, this attitude of persecution would infect the nation. It wouldn't be good for the nation. This would also be a poor legacy to be remembered by. So sort of playing on pride and reputation. You know, do you want to be remembered as the government that forced people into prison for what they believed? And also using force wouldn't achieve the goal of trying to manage religious settlement, because that's not how Christ works. Force itself is a sin. And you would then need to face the charge of sin. So not only would you be doing a job that you shouldn't be doing, but you would be sinning in the way that you did that job. And if you broke the holy law, why wouldn't then everyone else break the holy law? What kind of example would you be setting? And if you enforced conformity, it would create a nation of hypocrites, forced to say one thing, but believe another. Who could you really trust? Because it would just be a surface conformity. And enforcing conformity would destroy people's souls and would lose the rulers any sense of moral high ground over heathenish people or papist groups. So there's still some people who are outside the pale here. Limiting toleration would affect trade and merchandise, as trade depends on people who are prepared to travel and listen to difference. And it, above all, might even lead to war. And we know how expensive that is and all this kind of stuff. So, the wrong people and the wrong groups could be constrained, and heretics might be allowed to rise in prominence. So it depends who's enforcing the conformity. That's a critical issue. And basically this would just totally damage your reputation as a government. Okay? Now this is a totally different kind of rhetoric from just, a couple of years earlier, where, you need to repent or, all of your majesty and riches will fade away. This is saying, basically, think about this reasonably. Think about your own reputation. Think about scripture, but think about justice. Think about the kind of job you're trying to do here in governing the thing. We're offering you some advice, and we want to be part of this just world. Okay? So it's very much a reconciliatory line, trying to secure